At first, it seemed to be just the adults and it made sense, with the recession and all. People were working longer and harder than ever, but then every night on the news a story would run about how more and more people were slipping into coma-like states, going into deep sleep and never waking up. World governments rushed to find the source of this epidemic. All virus and disease control studies came back negative. Strict extended holiday policies were put into place across all businesses, and work and school hours were reduced. All food and even tap water was now even enriched with caffeine in a last-ditch attempt to slow down whatever was happening. Of course, there were conspiracy theorists who decided to consume only baby food, which was excluded from the caffeine supplementation. They believed it to be all an elaborate ruse from the government for population control. There were stories of people going into a deep sleep and their family would try to visit them in hospitals, but being unable to find them. But on the news these theories were often factually debunked. Hospitals filled to the brink with deep sleep patients. They began repurposing multi-story car parks to fit beds instead of cars, and slowly but surely, without reason, it seemed that everyone and everything was susceptible. It wasn't uncommon to now see birds fall out of the sky, or even sleeping beside cats and dogs on the sidewalk. It wasn't long before driving and commandeering all vehicles was banned. Too many cases of people falling asleep at the wheel or worse, pilots falling asleep at the wheel of domestic flights. Trains continued for a while but also saw a ban. This led to a global lockdown of sorts. You wanted to travel to other cities. Walk or cycle. Bicycles were manufactured and sold in a minute. Police used electric ones to patrol the streets, and for normal people our main mode of transport was push bikes. Stories were circulating of people cycling to countries to visit a family member only to find them on their couch or in their bed in a deep sleep. It's crazy how quickly humans adjust to new realities. All of a sudden all of this just became the norm. I come from a rather unique family. My father met my mom at 4 in the morning. He was a clerk at a gas station and she was driving around aimlessly, playing music as she couldn't sleep when she needed gas. They both hit it off and it's fair to say that both are pretty hardcore insomniacs, even to this day. Needless to say, this trait somehow passed on to me. I joke that the three of us are like a family of cats, only taking these little naps at random times yet being able to operate like the 7 to 8 hour sleepers. Maybe we were lucky but we'd never fall into those deep sleeps. My parents were nervous every time I'd put my head down on a pillow yet deeply relieved when I'd get up, and often I'd surprisingly feel refreshed, almost like I was sleeping better than ever. I was wondering how that could be in such troubling and uncertain times. Why now am I getting the best rest of my life? My parents echoed similar remarks about their restful naps when a theory popped into my head. What if we have hit a point of evolution where it is imperative that we adapt to napping as our main method of sleep? I exclaimed to my dad while I sat on the floor watching the nightly news on TV. "Don't be ridiculous," my father said in a conclusive tone. He was a kind and loving dad, but he had a stern side around certain subjects, and for some reason, sleep was one of them. I've always been super curious about what they are calling the deep sleep epidemic. I would say most people have it at the top of their lists of concerns. My mom and dad were different though. Their problems seemed to be primarily focused on what was now considered rather trivial, like mortgages and old world stuff. They only seemed concerned with the deep sleep when it came to me. We lived in a big house, and to my friend's disbelief, I had never met any extended family of any sort. From what I understood, both my mom and dad's side had disagreed with my parents forming such a young infatuation and marriage, rather extreme I believe, as they were 19 and 20 at the time, and old enough to make their own decisions. When I turned 18, I was presented with some very surprising news that my mom couldn't give birth, so they adopted me very young. I have no memory of my time before my parents' care or of an orphanage. My school therapist told me this can be a common response to instability when you are very young. She labeled it dissociation. In the old world, I could always feel a layer of isolation around me and my family. We lived in a big house with no pets and rarely any visitors. I went to a private school and my classes consisted of 3 to 4 students. 5 students were considered a packed class. You can imagine my surprise at seeing school depicted on the TV. It was ludicrous to see so many people crammed into such a space. It didn't make sense to me. My father liked to keep things private in regards to his life. He told me he got a lucky break after his time in the gas station, and following meeting my mom, this landed him into a completely new life with more money than he could ever imagine. This lucky break was a job that he'd go to at 2 a.m. to 4 p.m. He was out and gone and back not a fraction late ever at 4:10 p.m. This meant that his workplace must have been close and his work very routine. Throughout the years, I always asked if there was a bring your kid to work day, as I'd seen this concept a lot on TV. He'd laugh and say it doesn't really exist yet. I've been on the internet once and I googled it, and I know it does. We got the highest speed internet installed years ago, but it had to be taken out as I was told it was interfering with a local advanced electric power transmission that was apparently utilizing every possible frequency and signal. They installed a much weaker internet and it's painstaking to use. I'd go bored having read my library of books thrice over and my parents would bring me more from my collection, or I'd rent some from my private school library. The librarian has been in a deep sleep for 6 weeks, however, so the library is only allowed to be used when one of our teachers are present. I had a mundane dream imagining what this advanced electric power transmission tower looks like, and climbing over layers of big walls to see it. I woke up from a small nap, only 15 minutes long, and I was hit with a wave of euphoria. It was almost like being on some kind of drug or happily drunk. I let out a random laugh and recalled a book I read about dreams and how REM sleep typically commences hours into the sleeping state. I heard some faint joyous jazz music coming from down the stairs in the living room, so I walked down the winding stairs as the music got louder. The warm lights of the living room saturated the darkness of the hallway in a rather mystical way. I peered around the corner to see my mom and dad smile from ear to ear in an energetic and almost childlike dance. They looked to be having the time of their lives, and this subsequently made me happy, but when they noticed my presence they seemed to calm themselves down and attempt to jump back to a normal spirit. No, I exclaimed, sorry to interrupt. I'm glad you guys are having a good time. You must be hungry, dear. My mom brushed her dress down and resumed normalcy. No, I feel bad for stopping your dance, I laughed. I was happy that everyone was in such a good mood tonight. My dad let out a big burst of laughter. He couldn't help but find the whole situation hilarious. I could tell he was in an incredible mood. We are all in such a great mood tonight. We should do something, I exclaimed. It only gets better, my dad blurted out. From the corner of my eye, I observed my mom, albeit distantly in the kitchen, temporarily snap out of her elated mood to give my dad a glance that he said something he shouldn't have. My dad doesn't catch it as his laughter has brought him to putting his hands on his knees and looking at the floor. I can see that my mom has remained in her elated mood, yet she looks a little more on edge. Everything okay, Mom? She looks at me and I can tell in her eyes that she's slightly disconcerted, although her wide grin tries to tell me otherwise. Of course, darling. I know my mom well enough to see in this millisecond that she is scamming her brain for something to say. Oh, we should do something tonight. That would be fabulous. She found it. At this point, my dad is rolling on the floor. It's like he has taken a super drug and is in a state of absolute bliss and transcendent euphoria. Something doesn't quite feel right about my parents' lack of awareness now growing around their contrasting elation. My dad's happiness seems genuine, whereas my mom's appears to now be put on like a mask of sorts. Oh, there is something else. My eyes go back to my mom. Your school called today and unfortunately all of the staff have fallen into a deep sleep. Classes are cancelled for the foreseeable future. I'm stunned by the news and zapped into this existential dread. Once my mom sees this, she immediately mirrors me. A veil had fallen, a perception of my reality, and my whole life seemed to somehow fall. I was now suspicious of my parents. I look to my father and he's still hysterically happy until we catch each other's eyes and he springs up in full energy to his feet and also meets me with an artificial empathic glance. I feel fear in my own home, with my own mother and father. This is heavy news. You should go get some rest, son. My fight Flight or freeze had chosen to freeze, but I managed to give a single nod before heading back up the winding stairs. I heard the jazz music stop, but from the very top, I swear I could hear the shuffling of feet on the wooden floors before it went silent again. I arrived back to my room and threw myself back onto my bed. A rapid knock on my door and my heart began to race. My mom enters with a big decorative tray. "I've brought your favorite food, sweet potato fries," she says in an overly enthusiastic tone. I work up the courage to ask Mom if my teachers have gone into a deep sleep. "Why were you and Dad so happy and dancing?" My heartbeat begins to speed a bit as I get the question out. She scoffs, "Son, life goes on. If you get hung up on every little tragedy, then you will never live. Besides, me and your father won't have to pay the overpriced tuition anymore, and you can be homeschooled. We've found a tutor already," my mom continues, what feels like a seemingly well-rehearsed response when my father walks in. A completely different man than what I had seen downstairs. He appears almost mournful, but it's almost like he's really trying to hold himself back from grinning, like a child at a funeral who doesn't understand the gravity or context of the situation. But these were teachers I really loved, and Mrs. Jones, the librarian, they really cared about us students. I interrupted. My dad points to the big clock in my room that reads 1 a.m. "Well, look at the time. I have work in an hour." He softly grabs my mom on her shoulders and ushers her to go to bed with him. "We are really sorry for this news, son, and we understand how much your teachers mean to you, but now we must be getting to bed as I have work in an hour." My mom looks back on their way out, pointing to the sweet potato fries. "Enjoy your late supper. Your tutor will be coming in the morning." They close the door, and I hear them close the door to their room down the hall too. I start to question what I've seen and felt this evening. Could the euphoria I woke up with cause me to be almost delirious? Am I imagining it all? What did my dream mean? And maybe it wasn't so mundane. In fear of waking my parents, I very quietly opened and closed my door. I needed some cold water to the face as I headed to the big bathroom that was halfway down the hall before I was met with a faint sound that was unmistakably like bouncing on the bed. I tiptoe to just outside my parents' door, and I hear quiet laughter. It sounds like they are having the time of their lives, bouncing on the bed like children. This confirmed my unease. I knew from that moment I was going to my dad's work. I knew I had to learn more about these people I called my parents. I continued my tiptoeing down the winding stairs until I was swallowed into the darkness of the hallway. I hid behind a pullover curtain for what felt like half an hour before I was met with the sound of my dad ecstatically hopping down the stairs. He let out a childlike wee as he reached the bottom and jumped what sounded like 6 steps. His feet hit the floor and he marched in a military-like trance to the door. My parents never drank alcohol. They advocated against all substances, and I knew they wouldn't take anything knowingly. So what if they had somehow been drugged? This is a big possibility. Maybe the global scare is hitting them too, and this is their attempt to medicate the anxiety away. If so, my dad shouldn't be going to work anyway, so I must follow him. I rationalized my decision as best as I could, knowing a big part of me was also yearning to grow closer to my father and the strange newfound feelings of wanting to really protect him. He brushes past the curtain I am hiding behind and opens up the front door before swiftly closing it behind him. I peer out the small pattern window of the door, and to my disbelief, I see a luxurious black car parked with the engine running, waiting on my dad, who is now skipping towards the back seat. He opens the door and climbs in. I see a red suede interior, but I can't make out who is driving due to the deeply tinted windows. All cars are banned from use, so how on earth could my father be picked up in one? Just how illegal was his work? Many thoughts seemed to flood my mind. I used to go out to my back garden on the hill every night for hours and just look into the stars. I'd get lost in them. I would imagine dancing between them and feeling like I am astral projecting to and from each one, narrowly dodging them. Some nights these gray clouds just seemed to drift in and block everything. I would patiently wait for them to reveal some stars, almost like they presented me with some kind of hope. I would try my best to rendezvous with them every night, even better if the moon was out. Tonight it appeared starless. The car left in no time between my dad getting in and taking off down our driveway and through our gate. It must have been the adrenaline that fueled me to hop on my bike and race down the driveway before our automatic gates closed, but I was tailing the black car from a distance, just seeing the very back of it at every turn. It took down the forested back roads. I almost lost it due to how efficient the driver was. I hauled on both brakes as I saw the red brake lights of the car through the tree line. It was stopping. I hop off my bike and peer around the thick tree at the corner of the road. We were at the entrance of the advanced electric power transmission tower. It was the sight from my dream. I watched as the black car gained entry through layers upon layers of walls. I observed men dressed in army fatigues with heavy weaponry. So this is where my dad worked. There was no way I could breach it. A crazy idea came to mind. I knew my dad had a special uniform he'd wear that was always zipped in a black cover and hung in his wardrobe. He told me to never touch or open it, and he must have had about 7 uniforms at a given time, one for each day of the week, I'd assume. Unlike in my dream, I understood that these walls with guards are completely unscalable. Impersonating an employee such as my father is the only way I will be able to gain entry. It was a crazy idea, but what else could I do? As I turn to head home, I see headlights of what appears to be another car coming down the road. This time my fight or flight kicks in for the better, and I rapidly grab my bike and throw it into the bushes that line the forest before jumping into them myself. I land on a bush of thorns and do my best to silence my shriek of pain, but it doesn't work. An identical car to the one my dad was picked up in was parked directly on the road in front of me. It seems to hover for a moment, and it becomes clear that I have been spotted. The driver door flings open and what appears to be a tall, slender figure extends out, their face blacked out by what either appears to be a thin balaclava or worse, its skin. I get up and trip in the thorns as I try to run back into the shroud of the forest, but its arms seamlessly extend and entrap me like a spider suspending a fly. Terrified, time froze as I was held and suspended 5 feet from the ground. A human emerges from the back seat of the car with what appears to be some kind of toolkit. He is wearing the same uniform that my dad left in today, and he also bolsters a large grin as he skips towards me. He jumps right over my bike in the thorns. He places the toolkit just where my feet were before the arms of the driver suspended me. He opens the toolkit and begins tying my feet together with this thick wire that appears to be alive. It spirals up and around my legs before tying my hands together and warping to close around my head and mouth. It prevents me from screaming out loud, and all I see and hear is black. I must have passed out from the panic as I could no longer feel the extended arms of the driver. I am lying down and I can feel a pillow on the back of my head. I feel like I am in a sensory deprivation tank with moments piercing in of where I really am. This has all been an elaborate lucid dream nightmare surely. I just can't open my eyes. It must be sleep paralysis. I scream, wake up, wake up. But my screams are still being silenced, and it's like they're echoing into some deep cavern of darkness you throw a stone into, with sound bouncing off the walls. Something relieves itself from covering my eyes, and I'm met with a blurred vision as I squint deeply at the new incoming light. It's faint and has a dull crimson overlay. I blink a lot, and with every blink, my vision becomes slightly more clear. I am in a circular pod that has just enough room to contain a bed, not tall enough for me to stand, but just enough for me to be able to sit up. I wish I never sat up. I wish I was put into a deep sleep because what I saw was far worse than any nightmare. I was in a profoundly big underground room with connecting tubes to the top of every sleeping pod, all leading towards this faceless humongous organism of warping, an animated flesh that was constantly animatedly moving and growing, feeding off the deep sleepers. Many tubes led up and out of the room. You could see for miles and miles until the end of the human side of these sleeper pods. It was the most startling sight anyone could ever see. One tube didn't lead from a sleeper pod, but it led to a very enlarged pod that contained computers and self-operating machinery that was drawing what appeared to be levels going up. A further tube was dispensing pills into another large pod that fell onto a conveyor belt where I saw men with my father's uniform collect and package them into typical household products such as water bottle packs, dinner packs, coffee grounds, and even dishwasher soap. I noticed that from these hundreds of thousands of pods of sleepers, I was the only one sitting up. I looked back at the big pod and saw a man looking at me through binoculars. I hear a sound and smell a faint gas enter the pod. I close my eyes for another little nap. I wake up in my bedroom with my parents intently watching over me, concealing the faintest grin. thank you to my super fans, Sweet Black Swan, Tacy, and Brooklyn. I really appreciate you guys supporting my channel, and I look forward to making more content for everyone.